The ice beneath my boots cracked like gunshots as I made my way down to the Yukon River that February morning, my breath forming clouds so thick I could barely see 3 feet ahead. Pa had sent me to check the fish traps before the storm hit, but something felt different about the silence that morning. Too heavy, too complete, like the land itself was holding its breath. The wind had died to an unnatural stillness, and even the ravens that usually cawed from the spruce trees were nowhere to be heard. My fingers, already numb despite the thick moose-hide mittens Ma had sewn for me, fumbled with the trap lines, as in strange unease settled deep in my chest. The temperature had dropped to 40 below during the night, cold enough to freeze spit before it hit the ground. But that wasn't what made my skin crawl. Something was waiting for me down by that Riverbank, something that would shatter the only life I'd ever known. What I found there would haunt me for the rest of my days, and if you stay with me through this story, you'll understand why some discoveries are better left buried beneath the ice. I'd been walking the same path to the river for 15 years, ever since Pa first taught me to set snares and check trap lines. But that morning, every familiar landmark seemed foreign and menacing. The towering spruce trees, usually my companions in the wilderness, loomed like dark sentinels against the gray sky, their branches heavy with snow that hadn't fallen in weeks. My snowshoes sank deeper than usual into the powder, each step requiring more effort, as if the earth itself was trying to slow my progress. The cold air burned my lungs with every breath, and I pulled my wool scarf higher over my face, leaving only my eyes exposed to scan the frozen landscape ahead. Pa always said the wilderness had its own language, and those who learned to listen would never be caught off guard. But that morning, the silence spoke of something I wasn't prepared to hear. As I rounded the bend where the river curved toward our fishing grounds, my heart began to race for reasons I couldn't yet understand. The trap lines were still 50 yards away, but I could already sense that this day would divide my life into 2 parts, before and after what lay waiting in the snow. My boots found the familiar deer path that led down the embankment, worn smooth by countless trips to tend our nets and lines that kept food on our table through the brutal Alaska winters. The riverbank stretched before me like a white canvas, pristine except for the dark patches where the current ran too fast to freeze completely. Steam rose from those open sections, creating ghostly spirals that danced in the frigid air before, disappearing into the overcast sky. I could smell the metallic scent of ice and the faint musk of beaver from their lodge upstream, familiar odors that usually brought comfort in their predictability. But underneath those known scents lingered something else, something that made my stomach clench with inexplicable dread. The first trap was empty, which wasn't unusual given how the fish moved sluggishly in winter, but as I moved toward the second line, my peripheral vision caught something that didn't belong. A dark shape jutted from the snow near a fallen cottonwood log, too angular and deliberate to be natural debris. What I initially mistook for a discarded fur coat would soon reveal itself as something far more sinister. 20 feet from the trap lines, I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart hammering so hard I was sure it would crack my ribs. The dark shape wasn't a coat or a bundle of furs. It was a person, or what remained of one, partially buried in a drift that had formed around the fallen log. Long black hair spilled across the snow like spilled ink, and a pale hand extended. From beneath the white powder, fingers curved as if reaching for help that never came. I stood frozen for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, my mind struggling to process what my eyes were seeing. Every instinct screamed at me to run back to the cabin to get Pa to pretend I'd never taken this path at all. But my feet moved forward of their own accord, drawn by a mixture of horror and terrible curiosity that I couldn't resist. The wind picked up slightly, causing the loose snow to swirl around the figure like a miniature blizzard, alternately revealing and concealing details I wasn't sure I wanted to see. As I got closer, I could make out the woman's clothing, A blue wool dress that had once been fine, now torn and stained with what I prayed was just mud. But the cold had preserved everything with crystal clarity, and I knew I was looking at something that would change everything about our quiet life in the wilderness. My hands shook as I knelt beside her, not from the cold, but from the terrible certainty that this woman had died alone and afraid, far from anyone who might have helped her. She was young, maybe 25 or 30, with delicate features that spoke of a life far removed from the harsh realities of frontier existence. Her skin had the waxy, translucent quality that comes from prolonged exposure to extreme cold, but her clothing suggested she wasn't from around here. The dress was too fine, the boots too delicate for serious wilderness travel. A small leather satchel lay partially buried beside her, its brass clasp green with age and frost, and I could see the corner of what looked like papers poking out from beneath the flap. The urge to open that bag was overwhelming, but something held me back. Perhaps the reverence due to the dead, or maybe the superstitious fear that touching her belongings might somehow connect me to whatever fate had brought her to this lonely place. I brushed the snow from her face with trembling fingers, revealing eyes that stared sightlessly at the gray sky above, and in that moment I understood that finding her wasn't an accident. Someone or something had led me here, and the woman frozen in the snow held secrets that people would kill to keep buried. Standing up on unsteady legs, I looked around the riverbank with new eyes, searching for clues that might explain how a well-dressed woman had ended up dead in one of the most remote corners of Alaska. The snow around her had been undisturbed for weeks, maybe months, but I could make out faint depressions that might have been footprints, leading from the river's edge toward the tree line before disappearing entirely. No signs of a struggle, no scattered belongings to suggest she'd been robbed or attacked. Just a woman who had somehow walked into the wilderness and never walked out again. The nearest settlement was Dawson Creek Trading Post, 15 miles through some of the most unforgiving terrain in the territory, and no one made that journey alone unless they were running from something terrible or toward something desperate. I knew I should cover her back up with snow, show proper respect for the dead while I went to get help, but something made me hesitate. The wind shifted again, carrying with it the faint scent of wood smoke from our cabin, reminding me that Pa would be wondering where I was. That normal life was continuing just a mile away while I stood over this frozen mystery. But as I reached for the handful of snow to cover her face, I noticed something that made my blood run colder than the February air. A thin gold chain around her neck, and hanging from it, a locket that looked exactly like the one my mother had, worn until the day she disappeared 10 years ago. The world tilted on its axis as I stared at that familiar piece of jewelry, my mind racing through possibilities I didn't want to consider. Ma had vanished during a blizzard when I was 12, and Pa always said she'd gotten lost trying to reach the trading post for medicine when I was sick with fever. We never found her body, never found any trace of what had happened to her, and eventually the search parties gave up and life moved on the way it does in places where death is a constant companion. But that locket, I could see the tiny roses engraved on its surface, the delicate chain that had caught the lamplight so many evenings as Ma sat by the fire mending our clothes. With hands that wouldn't stop trembling, I reached toward the woman's neck, desperate to see if the locket would open, if it contained the miniature photographs of Pa and me that Ma's had held. But as my fingers touched the cold metal, a sound broke through the morning silence that made me jump back like I'd been burned. The distant but unmistakable sound of dogs barking, growing closer by the second. Someone was coming, and instinct told me that being found here with this body would bring nothing but trouble. I had seconds to decide whether to run or stay, whether to trust whatever was heading toward me through the snow, and as the barking grew louder, I realized that finding this woman was only the beginning of a nightmare that would consume everything I thought I knew about my family and myself. Without thinking, I grabbed the leather satchel from beside the woman's body and shoved it inside. My coat, the cold leather burning against my ribs like a brand. The dog team was getting closer. I could hear the scrape of sled runners on ice and a man's voice calling commands to his animals, and every survival instinct Pa had drilled into me screamed that I needed to disappear before whoever was coming found me with the body. But as I turned to run, my eyes fell on that locket one more time, and I made a decision that would haunt me for months to come. I reached down and yanked the chain from around the woman's neck, the delicate links snapping like my own connection to innocence. The metal was so cold it stuck to my fingers, but I forced it into my coat pocket alongside the stolen bag, my heart pounding with guilt and terror in equal measure. Behind me, I could hear the dogs getting excited, probably catching the scent of death on the wind. And I knew I had maybe 30 seconds before they rounded the bend and spotted both me and the frozen woman. I covered her face and torso with loose snow as quickly as I could, though it felt like a betrayal to bury her again when she'd already been hidden for so long. The sound of approaching voices pushed me into action, and I stumbled up the embankment toward the safety of the tree line, clutching the stolen evidence against my chest, and knowing that I'd crossed a line I could never uncross. What I'd found by the riverbank wasn't just a body. It was the first thread of a mystery that would unravel everything I believed about my mother's disappearance and my father's secrets. As I crouched behind a massive spruce tree 50 yards, from where the woman lay, my breath came in sharp puffs that I was sure would give away my position to whoever was approaching with the dog team. Through the branches, I could see 3 figures emerge from the river bend, 2 men and what looked like a teenage boy, all bundled in heavy furs and moving with the purposeful stride of people who knew exactly where they were going. The lead dog, a massive Malamute with gray markings, went straight to the spot where I'd found the woman, his nose working frantically as he whined and paced in circles around the hastily replaced snow. One of the men, tall, bearded, wearing a red wool coat I didn't recognize, gestured toward the area and said something I couldn't hear over the wind that had started to pick up again. They weren't surprised to find her there, I realized, with a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. They'd come looking for her specifically, which meant they knew she was there, which meant they knew a lot more about this mysterious woman than I did. As I watched them begin to dig her out of the snow with practiced efficiency, the weight of the stolen satchel pressed against my ribs like a guilty secret, and I understood that I'd stumbled into something far more dangerous than a simple death in the wilderness. Whatever secrets that woman had died protecting were now mine to carry, and the men currently uncovering her frozen body looked like the kind who would kill to get them back. 3 days passed before I could bring myself to examine what I'd taken from the frozen woman. 3 days of jumping at every sound and watching Pa's face for signs that he knew what I'd done. The leather satchel sat hidden beneath loose floorboards in my room like a coiled snake, and Ma's locket, or what I believed was Ma's locket, burned against my chest where I'd hung it beneath my undershirt, the metal never seeming to warm despite my body heat. Pa noticed my distraction, of course. 15 years of living in isolation had made him sensitive to every shift in mood or behavior, and I caught him studying me with those pale blue eyes that missed nothing. He'd mentioned the dog. Team that had passed our property boundary, casual-like, asking if I'd seen anything unusual during my trips to check the trap lines. I'd shake my head and concentrate on my chores, splitting firewood and tending to our small cache of preserved meat, but inside I was coming apart like a poorly sewn seam. The guilt of lying to the only family I had left weighed heavier than the stolen evidence, but something deeper than fear kept me silent. A growing certainty that the woman's death was connected to secrets Pa had been keeping from me for 10 long years. Every time he turned his back, I found myself studying his movements, wondering what other truths might be hidden behind those weathered hands and careful words. On the 4th morning, Pa announced we needed supplies from Dawson Creek Trading. Post, the first time in 6 months he'd suggested making the difficult journey through the mountain pass. His timing felt too convenient, too carefully planned, and I watched his face as he made the announcement over our breakfast of dried salmon and bitter coffee. Something flickered in his expression, relief maybe, or the satisfaction of a man who'd been waiting for the right moment to make his move. He claimed we were low on flour and ammunition, but I'd inventoried our stores just the week before and knew we had enough to last until spring thaw. The excuse felt thin as January ice, and as we loaded our sled with furs to trade and supplies for the journey, I couldn't shake the feeling that Pa was eager to hear what people were saying about recent events. The woman's body would have been found by now, her death becoming the kind of news that spread through isolated communities like wildfire, and I suspected Pa wanted to gauge the mood at the trading post before whatever storm was coming finally broke. As our dogs pulled us through the narrow trail that wound between towering pines and across frozen streams, I clutched the hidden satchel closer to my body and wondered if I was sitting next to the man responsible for putting that woman in the snow. The familiar rhythm of the sled runners should have been comforting, but instead it sounded like the countdown to something terrible and inevitable. Dawson Creek Trading Post sat in a clearing surrounded by mountains that seemed to scrape. The belly of the gray sky, its log buildings arranged around a central courtyard like wagons circled against attack. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys, and I could see at least a dozen sleds and dog teams scattered around the perimeter, more activity than the settlement usually saw in the dead of winter. The main building squatted like a fortress against the elements, its thick walls chinked with mud and moss, small windows glowing yellow with lamplight that looked warm and inviting from our position on the ridge above. But as we descended toward the trading post, I noticed an unusual tension in the way people moved between buildings. Quick, furtive steps instead of the leisurely pace of winter commerce, heads turning constantly to scan the tree line as if expecting trouble to emerge from the forest at any moment. Pa guided our team toward the main building with practiced ease, but I caught him checking our back trail twice during the descent, his hand resting casually on the rifle that never left his side during these trips. The normal sounds of a busy trading post, laughter, shouting, the clash of metal tools, were muted, replaced by the low murmur of serious conversation and the kind of watchful silence that meant bad news had already arrived. As we pulled up to the hitching area, I realized that whatever had brought that woman to her death by our riverbank had consequences that reached far beyond our isolated cabin, and the answers I was looking for might be waiting inside these walls. The moment we stepped through the heavy oak door, the conversation in the main room dropped to a whisper, and I felt every eye in the place turn toward us like we were carrying plague. The trading post's interior was thick with wood smoke and the smell of unwashed bodies, fur and strong tobacco, but underneath those familiar odors lurked something else. Fear, sharp and metallic, the kind that made people reach instinctively for weapons. Old Henrik Johansson stood behind the main counter like always, his massive frame filling the space between floor-to-ceiling shelves stocked with everything from ammunition to medicine bottles, but his usually jovial face was creased, with worry lines that hadn't been there during our last visit. Pa approached the counter with his normal unhurried stride, but I noticed how his eyes swept the room, cataloging faces and positions like a man preparing for battle. "Henrik," Pa said by way of greeting, his voice carrying the careful neutrality he used when testing dangerous waters. The big Norwegian nodded back, but his attention kept drifting to the group of men huddled around the potbelly stove in the corner, their low voices creating a buzz of urgent communication that set my teeth on edge. I pretended to browse the shelves while straining to catch fragments of their conversation, words like murder and strangers and government men floating through the smoke-hazed air like harbingers of trouble. The stolen satchel felt like it was burning a hole through my coat, and I wondered if everyone in the room could somehow sense the guilt I was carrying. Henrik leaned across the counter toward Pa, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper as he spoke words that made my blood freeze in my veins. "Found a woman's body down by the Yukon 3 days back. he said, his accent thickening the way it did when he was agitated. Young thing, well-dressed, been dead for months by the look of her. Had papers on her, government papers, and now there's federal marshals asking questions about folks who ain't been seen lately. Pa's face could have been carved from stone, showing no more emotion than the log walls around us, but I caught the slight tightening around his eyes that meant he was processing dangerous information. My heart hammered against my ribs as I realized. The men who'd found the woman's body had discovered something I'd missed, evidence that painted her death in an even more sinister light than I'd imagined. What kind of questions? Pa asked, his tone still carefully neutral, but with an edge underneath that I'd only heard a few times in my life, usually just before violence erupted. Henrik glanced around the room to make sure no one else was listening, then leaned even closer. Questions about women who might have been traveling through the territory last summer. Women who might have had reason to be carrying federal documents about mining claims and territorial boundaries. The words hit me like a physical blow because I suddenly understood why that locket had looked so familiar, why finding it around the dead woman's neck had felt like a message from the grave. But the revelation also brought a terrifying new question. If that woman had been carrying my mother's locket, what had happened to my mother? And how much did Pa know about both their fates? The conversation around the stove grew more heated, and I caught the attention of one of the men, a stranger with a scarred face and city clothes that marked him as an outsider, even more clearly than his soft hands and pale complexion. He'd been watching our exchange with Henrik, and something about his interest made my skin crawl with the same instinctive revulsion I felt when surprised by a snake. Pa must have sensed the scrutiny because he straightened up from the counter, his casual posture shifting into something more alert and dangerous. We should get our trading done and head back before the weather turns, he said to Henrik, loud enough for the entire room to hear, but his words carried a subtext that anyone familiar with frontier life would understand. We're leaving before trouble finds us. But the stranger by the stove had other ideas, rising from his chair with deliberate slowness and approaching our position with the confidence of a man who'd never learned to fear the wilderness or the people who called it home. "Excuse me," he said, his Eastern accent cutting through the room like a blade, "but I wonder if I might have a word with you gentlemen about recent events in the area." His smile was as cold as the wind outside, and I could see Pa's hand drift toward his rifle as he calculated distances and exits. "I'm Deputy Marshal William Crenshaw, and I'm investigating some irregularities in federal land claims that may be connected to the recent discovery of a woman's remains." The room fell silent except for the crackling of the fire, and I realized that the careful balance of our isolated life was about to be shattered by forces we couldn't control or escape. Pa's response came with the measured calm of a man who'd faced down bears and survived blizzards that killed weaker souls. "Don't know nothing about any woman or any land claims, Marshal," he said, each word chosen with the precision of a trapper setting snares. "My daughter and I keep to ourselves, mind our own business, and don't trouble with government affairs." But Crenshaw's smile widened, showing teeth that were too white and too sharp for my liking, and I could see he wasn't the type to be easily discouraged by frontier stoicism. Of course," he said, pulling a small notebook from his coat pocket with movements so practiced they seemed rehearsed. "But you see, the deceased woman was carrying documents that suggest certain irregularities in mining claims filed in this area over the past decade. Claims that may have been filed by people using false names or forged documentation." He flipped through pages covered with neat handwriting, and I caught glimpses of names and dates that made my stomach clench. "With recognition. I'm particularly interested in claims filed by women, especially women who may no longer be available to verify their signatures or explain their business in the territory." The words hung in the air like smoke, and I could feel the attention of everyone in the room focused on our little group as if we were actors in a play they'd all been waiting to see. Pa's silence stretched longer than was comfortable, and I knew he was weighing options, calculating risks, deciding how much truth he could afford to reveal without destroying whatever careful lies had kept us safe for the past 10 years. When Pa finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness that I'd never heard before, as if he was tired of carrying secrets that grew heavier with each passing year. "My wife died 10 years back," he said, the words hitting me like physical blows, because it was the first time he'd ever definitively stated that Ma was dead rather than missing. "Got lost in a blizzard trying to reach medical help when our girl was sick. Never found her body, but the wilderness don't always give back what it takes." Crenshaw nodded sympathetically, but his eyes remained calculating, predatory, fixed on Pa's face like he was reading signs in unfamiliar territory. "I'm sorry for your loss," the marshal said, though his tone suggested the condolence was purely professional. "But I wonder if your wife might have filed any mining claims before her death. The paperwork I'm examining suggests that several claims in this area were filed by a woman named Catherine Morrison, and the timing corresponds with your wife's presence in the territory." The name hit me like a rifle shot, because Morrison had been Ma's maiden name, the name she'd used before she married Pa and took his surname of Henley. But how did this stranger know details about my mother that I'd only learned by accident, overhearing conversations between Pa and the preacher who'd occasionally visited our area in those early years? As I watched the two men face each other, across the smoke-filled room, I realized that the woman I'd found frozen by the riverbank wasn't just connected to my mother's disappearance. She might have been the key to understanding what had really happened during that blizzard 10 years ago, and why Pa had never seemed surprised that Ma's body was never found. The tension in the room ratcheted higher as more men began to pay attention to our conversation, some drifting closer to hear better, while others positioned themselves near exits like they expected trouble to start at any moment. I could smell sweat and fear mixing with the smoke, and the familiar comfort of the trading post had transformed into something that felt more like a trap closing around us. Crenshaw continued to flip through his notebook, each turned page feeling like another step toward a precipice I couldn't see but could definitely feel approaching. "You see, Mr. Henley," he said, using Pa's name with casual familiarity that suggested he knew far more about us than he was revealing, "the woman we found had been carrying documentation that suggests she was investigating irregularities in mining claims filed throughout this territory. Claims that may have been filed by people who were subsequently murdered to prevent them from revealing what they'd discovered about illegal mining operations." The word "murdered" hung in the air like a curse, and I saw several men reach instinctively for weapons, while others began edging toward the door with the careful movements of people preparing to flee. Pa remained perfectly still, but I could see the muscle in his jaw twitching the way it did when he was fighting to control his temper or his fear. "That's a serious accusation, Marshal," he said finally, his voice carrying a warning that anyone familiar with frontier justice would recognize. "Hope you got more than suspicion and old paperwork to back up claims like that." But even as he spoke, I could see the calculation in his eyes, the mental inventory of ammunition and escape routes that meant he was preparing for the possibility that talking our way out of this situation might not be an option. The stolen satchel pressed against my ribs like a guilty secret, and I wondered if the evidence I was carrying would condemn us or save us, assuming we lived long enough to find out which. The confrontation at the trading post might have escalated into violence if nature hadn't intervened with the sudden fury that only an Alaskan blizzard can unleash. The wind outside began howling like a wounded animal, rattling the thick log walls and sending snow spiraling past the windows in sheets so dense they blocked out what little daylight remained. Marshal Crenshaw looked toward the storm, with the expression of a city man who'd never experienced the raw power of wilderness weather, his confidence visibly wavering as the building shook under each gust. Pa seized the moment with the instincts of someone who'd survived 2 decades in country that killed the unprepared without mercy. "Storm's coming in fast," he announced to the room, his voice cutting through the tension like an axe through frozen wood. "Anyone planning to travel better get moving now, or they'll be stuck here for days." The marshal's pale face grew even, whiter as he realized his investigation would have to wait for Mother Nature's permission to continue. Henrik nodded grimly from behind his counter, already moving to secure shutters and check his emergency supplies with the efficiency of a man who'd weathered countless storms in this isolated outpost. But as the other men began preparing for the siege ahead, I caught Pa's eye and saw something that chilled me more than the wind outside, a look of grim satisfaction, as if this storm was exactly what he'd been hoping for. The pieces of a larger plan were falling into place, and I had the sinking feeling that we weren't running from the storm. We were running into something far more dangerous. Pa moved with calculated urgency, gathering our supplies and settling accounts with Henrik, while keeping one eye on the marshal, who was clearly out of his element in this frontier crisis. The other men in the trading post had shifted into survival mode, checking weapons and emergency gear with the focus of people who understood that nature was a more immediate threat than any human conflict. "We're heading out," Pa announced, though common sense dictated that traveling in a blizzard was suicide for anyone but the most experienced wilderness travelers. Crenshaw looked up from where he'd been studying his notebook, confusion and fear warring across his soft features. "Surely you can't be serious about traveling in this weather," he said, his Eastern accent making him sound even more foreign against the backdrop of howling wind. "It would be madness to attempt the mountain pass in a storm like this." Pa's smile was thin and cold as winter moonlight. "Been traveling these mountains for 20 years, Marshal. Know every trail, every shelter, every way the wind blows through the passes." But what he didn't say was equally important. He also knew that a blizzard would cover our tracks, make pursuit impossible, and give us time to reach whatever destination he had in mind. As I helped him load our sled outside in the driving snow, my fingers already numb despite thick mittens, I realized that Pa wasn't just fleeing the marshal's questions. He was leading us toward answers that someone had killed to keep buried. The storm wasn't our enemy. It was our camouflage, and whatever lay waiting for us beyond the mountain pass was worth risking our lives to reach. The first mile out of Dawson Creek was a nightmare of driving snow and howling wind that cut through our heaviest furs like they were made of paper. Our lead dog, Rex, struggled to find the trail markers Pa had set years ago, his powerful frame barely visible through the white curtain that had descended over the landscape like a burial shroud. I huddled on the sled behind Pa, who drove our team with the grim determination of a man following a path only he could see, his face protected by a wolf fur hood that made him look like some ancient hunter from the old stories. The temperature was dropping fast. I could feel it in the way the snow crunched under the sled runners and the way my breath froze instantly in the scarf wrapped around my face. Every instinct I possessed screamed that we should turn back, find shelter, wait out the storm like sensible people, but Pa pushed forward into the teeth of the blizzard as if demons were chasing us. Maybe they were. The stolen satchel pressed against my ribs with each jolt of the sled, a constant reminder of the secrets I was carrying and the questions I still needed to ask. But with the wind stealing our voices and the cold threatening to freeze the words in our throats, conversation was impossible, leaving me alone with thoughts that grew darker with each passing mile. The familiar landmarks of our territory disappeared behind walls of swirling snow, and I began to understand that we were crossing more than just geographical boundaries. We were leaving behind the life I'd known and heading toward truths that might destroy what remained of my family. 3 hours into our journey, Pa guided our exhausted team off the main trail and into a narrow canyon I'd never seen before, despite 15 years of exploring every corner of our territory. The walls rose on either side like the ribs of some massive beast, providing blessed relief from the worst of the wind, but creating an oppressive sense of being trapped in a place where the storm's echoes bounced back and forth like the voices of angry spirits. Our dogs stumbled through snow that reached their bellies, their usual enthusiasm replaced by the grim endurance of animals who understood they were fighting for survival. Pa seemed to know exactly where he was going, following landmarks invisible to my eyes, turning at specific rock formations and fallen trees as if he'd traveled this route many times before. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't desperation driving us into the storm. This was a planned route to a predetermined destination, and Pa had been preparing for this moment for years. "Where are we going?" I shouted over the wind, but he either didn't hear me or chose not to answer. His attention focused on navigating through terrain that seemed designed to swallow travelers whole. The canyon walls grew higher and narrower, cutting off what little light remained as afternoon faded toward evening, and I began to worry that we might be trapped in this stone corridor when full darkness fell. But just as claustrophobia started to claw at my chest, the canyon opened into a small valley protected by towering peaks. And there, barely visible through the blowing snow, I could make out the dark outline of a cabin that shouldn't have existed in this remote location. The cabin sat against the far wall of the valley like it had grown from the mountain itself, its log walls weathered gray by countless seasons of wind and snow. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, indicating recent habitation, and I could see the warm glow of lamplight through windows that had been carefully shuttered against the storm. This wasn't an abandoned trapper's shack or emergency shelter. This was someone's home, maintained and lived in, hidden away in a valley that didn't appear on any map I'd ever seen. Pa drove our team straight toward the structure with the confidence of a man arriving at his own front door, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature as I realized how many secrets he'd been keeping from me. "Who lives here?" I called out, but again he didn't answer, focused instead on securing our dogs in a lean-to shelter that had obviously been built to accommodate visitors. The cabin's front door opened before we reached it, spilling yellow light across the snow, and revealing a figure silhouetted against the warmth inside. Even through the blowing snow, I could see it was a woman. Tall, angular, wrapped in a heavy wool shawl that couldn't quite hide the rifle she held ready in her hands. She watched our approach with the wariness of someone who'd learned that unexpected visitors often brought nothing but trouble, but when Pa pulled back his hood and she saw his face, her posture relaxed slightly. "Thought you might be coming," she called out over the wind, her voice carrying an accent I couldn't quite place. "Especially after what happened down at the Riverbank." My blood turned to ice as I realized this woman knew about the frozen body I'd discovered, knew about the secrets I'd been carrying, and was somehow part of whatever conspiracy had been unfolding around me for the past week. As we stumbled through the cabin door into blessed warmth, I got my first clear look at our mysterious hostess and felt the ground shift beneath my feet once again. She was maybe 45, with prematurely gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes the color of winter sky. Intelligent, calculating, familiar in a way that made my chest tight with recognition I couldn't quite grasp. The cabin's interior was spartanly furnished but comfortable, with a stone fireplace throwing dancing shadows across walls lined with books, maps, and what looked like official documents. "Sarah," Pa said by way of greeting, his voice carrying a warmth I rarely heard him use with strangers. "Been a long time." She nodded, setting her rifle aside but keeping it within easy reach, a precaution that spoke to the dangerous nature of whatever business had brought us to this hidden valley. "Not long enough considering the circumstances," she replied, her gaze shifting to me with an intensity that made me want to step backward. "This would be Catherine's girl, then. She's got her mother's eyes." The casual reference to my mother hit me like a slap, especially the use of her first name spoken with the familiarity of old friendship. Pa shed his outer coat and moved toward the fire, but I remained frozen near the door, my mind racing through possibilities I didn't want to consider. Who was this woman who lived in secret isolation, who knew about my mother, who seemed to be expecting our arrival in the middle of a blizzard? The stolen satchel felt heavier than ever against my ribs, and I began to suspect that the documents inside might hold answers to questions I'd been too afraid to ask. But as Sarah's pale eyes continued to study me with uncomfortable intensity, I realized that getting those answers might require revealing secrets that could get us all killed. Pa and Sarah fell into conversation by the fire, their voices low and urgent, but not quite quiet enough to prevent me from catching fragments that made my skin crawl with foreboding. Words like federal investigation and mining rights and time running out drifted through the warm air, mixed with names I didn't recognize and references to events that seemed to stretch back years before my mother's disappearance. I pretended to warm my hands by the fire while straining to hear more. But they were speaking in the careful code of people who'd learned to discuss dangerous topics without revealing too much to potential eavesdroppers. Sarah kept glancing in, my direction as if evaluating how much I could be trusted with whatever knowledge they were sharing, and I caught Pa shaking his head slightly in response to some unspoken question about my involvement in their affairs. The cabin felt smaller with each passing minute, the walls pressing closer as I realized I was surrounded by people who knew far more about my life and my family than I did. Outside, the storm raged with increasing fury, cutting off any possibility of escape or retreat, trapping us together in this hidden valley until the weather decided to release its hold on the mountain passes. But even more frightening than the storm was the growing certainty that the woman I'd found frozen by the riverbank had died because she'd discovered the same secrets these two were now discussing, and that her death was just the beginning of something much larger and more dangerous. As Sarah rose to prepare food and Pa continued to stare into the fire with the expression of a man carrying unbearable burdens, I made a decision that would change everything. It was time to reveal what I'd taken from the dead woman's body. Time to force the truth into the open regardless of the consequences. The moment came after we'd eaten a simple meal of venison stew and hard bread, when the storm outside reached a crescendo that made the cabin walls shake and the windows rattle in their frames. Pa and Sarah were deep in quiet conversation about routes and timing and people I'd never heard of, their words creating a sense of urgency that filled the small space like smoke. I could feel the stolen satchel burning against my ribs like a brand, and the weight of unasked questions was becoming unbearable. "I need to show you something," I said, my voice cutting through their whispered planning like a knife through leather. Both of them turned toward me with expressions that shifted from surprise to alarm as I reached inside my coat and pulled out the leather bag I'd taken from the frozen woman's body. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the howling wind outside and the crackling of logs in the fireplace. Pa's face went through a series of emotions: shock, fear, anger, and finally a resignation that told me he'd been expecting this moment for longer than I'd realized. Sarah's reaction was more controlled but equally telling. Her hand drifted toward her rifle while her eyes fixed on the satchel like it was a snake that might strike at any moment. "Where did you get that?" she asked, her voice deadly quiet. And I understood that the next few minutes would determine whether we lived through this storm or joined the woman by the riverbank in whatever frozen hell awaited those who knew too much about the wrong secrets. The truth was about to come out, all of it, and the blizzard raging outside would seem gentle compared to the storm about to break inside this hidden cabin. The confession poured out of me like blood from a wound, each word feeling like a betrayal of everything I'd been taught about honesty and trust. I told them about finding the woman by the riverbank, about the men with the dog team who'd come looking for her, about stealing the satchel and the locket that had belonged to my mother, or so I believed. Pa's face grew grayer with each detail, his weathered hands clenching and unclenching, as if he was fighting the urge to either embrace me or shake me until my teeth rattled. Sarah listened with the stillness of a predator evaluating prey. Her pale eyes never leaving my face as I stumbled through explanations that sounded increasingly weak even to my own ears. When I finally fell silent, the only sounds were the storm outside and the frantic beating of my heart against my ribs. "Show me the locket," Sarah said finally, her voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. With trembling fingers, I pulled the chain from beneath my shirt, the gold catching the firelight as it swung between us like a pendulum counting down to judgment. The moment Sarah saw it, her carefully controlled composure cracked, revealing something raw and painful underneath. "Dear God," she whispered, reaching toward the locket with fingers that shook despite her obvious efforts at control. "I gave this to Catherine 20 years ago, before she married your father, before she came to this God-forsaken territory." The admission hit the room like a physical blow, and I realized I was finally about to learn truths that had been hidden from me my entire life. But as Sarah's fingers closed around the locket, I saw something in her eyes that made my blood run cold. Not just recognition, but guilt, the kind that comes from surviving when others don't. Pa stood abruptly from his chair by the fire, his movement so sudden and violent that both Sarah and I flinched as if expecting an attack. "You shouldn't have taken that," he said, his voice rough with emotions I'd never heard from him before. Grief, fear, and something that might have been relief. "You shouldn't have gotten involved in any of this." But Sarah's attention remained fixed on the locket, her fingers working the tiny clasp with the familiarity of someone who'd opened it countless times before. When it finally clicked open, revealing the miniature photographs inside, she made a sound like a wounded animal, half sob, half gasp of pain. "Look," she commanded, holding the open locket toward me with hands that couldn't quite stay steady. Inside were two small portraits, one of a young man I recognized as my father, clean-shaven and smiling in a way I'd never seen, and another of a woman who looked exactly like me but wasn't my mother. At least, not the woman I remembered as my mother. The face in the portrait was Sarah's, 20 years younger but unmistakably the same angular features, the same pale eyes, the same stubborn set to the jaw that I saw in my own reflection. The world tilted beneath my feet as the implications crashed over me like an avalanche, burying everything I thought I knew about my family, my identity, my very existence. "She's not your mother," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am." The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, and I understood that the woman I'd mourned for 10 years, the woman whose disappearance had shaped every day of my life since I was 12, had been living a lie that was about to destroy us all. The revelation shattered my world like ice breaking under spring thaw, sending everything I believed about myself cascading into an abyss of confusion and betrayal. Sarah, my mother apparently, set the locket carefully on the rough wooden table and began to speak in the measured tones of someone who'd rehearsed this confession 1,000 times but never found the courage to deliver it. "Catherine Morrison was my sister," she said, each word falling like stones into still water. "Younger by 3 years, prettier, softer, everything I wasn't. When James, your father, came to Montana looking for a wife, she's the one he chose, the one he married, the one he brought to Alaska to start a new life." My mind reeled as I tried to process this information, to understand how the woman I'd called mother for 12 years could have been my aunt, while my real mother lived in exile in this hidden valley. Pa hadn't moved from his position by the fire, but I could see his shoulders shaking with the effort of containing whatever storm was raging inside him. "Catherine couldn't have children," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger as she found her rhythm in this terrible confession. 5 years of trying, 5 years of miscarriages and heartbreak, 5 years of watching her marriage crumble under the weight of disappointment. So she came to me with a proposition that seemed reasonable at the time, but turned into a nightmare that's haunted us all for the past 16 years. The implications of her words hit me like a physical blow, and I sank into the nearest chair, as I realized that my entire existence was built on a foundation of lies, deception, and family secrets that had already cost at least one life. But even more terrifying was the growing certainty that the truth Sarah was revealing would eventually destroy what remained of all our lives. The story unfolded like a map of treacherous territory, each detail revealing new dangers and deeper deceptions than I could have imagined. Sarah had agreed to carry Catherine's child, me, in exchange for money that would allow her to disappear from a life that had become unbearable for reasons she didn't immediately explain. The pregnancy had been hidden from everyone except Pa, who'd traveled back and forth between Alaska and Montana to maintain the pretense that his wife was expecting. "When you were born," Sarah said, her eyes fixed on the fire as if she couldn't bear to look at me while revealing these truths, "Catherine was there to take you immediately. I was supposed to disappear, start over somewhere else, never contact any of you again. But a mother's bond isn't something you can just cut with a knife. And watching Catherine raise my daughter while pretending to be your mother nearly drove me insane." Pa finally spoke, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and old pain. "Sarah started following us, showing up in town, making demands. Catherine got scared, thought people would figure out the truth and the whole arrangement would collapse. So we decided to fake Catherine's death, let people think she died in a blizzard, while Sarah took her place as your mother." The casual way he described orchestrating such an elaborate deception made my stomach clench with nausea. But the worst was yet to come. "Only problem was," Sarah continued, her voice growing harder with each word, "Catherine decided she didn't want to disappear. She liked being your mother, liked the life she'd built, and she wasn't willing to give it up just because our original agreement said she should." The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop 10 degrees as I realized I was listening to a confession of murder, and the woman frozen by the riverbank hadn't been a stranger at all. She'd been the woman I'd called mother for the first 12 years of my life. The truth hit me with the force of an avalanche, burying everything I thought I knew about my family under an avalanche of lies, betrayal, and violence that stretched back to before my birth. Catherine, the woman I'd mourned as my dead mother, had been killed because she'd refused to honor an agreement that would have given me back to my real mother, Sarah, who'd been living in this hidden valley for 10 years while I grew up believing she was dead. "We didn't plan for it to happen the way it did," Pa said, his voice hollow with the weight of carrying such a terrible secret for so long. "Catherine was supposed to just disappear, start over somewhere else with enough money to live comfortably. But she'd grown attached to you, couldn't bear the thought of giving you up, and she threatened to expose the whole arrangement unless we let her keep you." Sarah's laugh was bitter as winter wind, devoid of any warmth or humor. "So she had to be silenced permanently because the alternative was losing everything: my daughter, my identity, my chance at the life I should have had from the beginning." The casual way they discussed murder made my skin crawl, but even more horrifying was the realization that I was the reason Catherine had died, that my existence had created the circumstances that led to her death by the riverbank, where I'd found her frozen body. "But why was she carrying government documents?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the storm outside. "Why were there federal marshals asking questions about mining claims?" The look that passed between Pa and Sarah was loaded with meanings I didn't want to understand. But I knew I was about to learn that Catherine's death was connected to secrets even more dangerous than family deception and murder. The stolen satchel sat on the table between us like evidence at a trial, and I realized that opening it would reveal the final layer of this nightmare that had been consuming my family for over a decade. Pa moved to the table with the slow, careful steps of a man approaching a loaded trap, his weathered hands hovering over the satchel's leather straps, as if touching them might trigger an explosion. Catherine wasn't just threatened by our arrangement, he said, his voice carrying the weight of confessions that had been festering like infected wounds for years. She'd discovered something else, something about the mining claims Sarah had filed in her name, something that made her dangerous to people with a lot more power and resources than our little family. Sarah stood and walked to one of the cabin's windows, peering out into the storm as if expecting to see armed men materializing from the swirling snow. The federal government's been investigating illegal mining operations throughout the territory, she said, her reflection ghost-like in the frost-covered glass. Operations that used forged documents, false identities, and murdered witnesses to establish claims on land that belonged to native tribes or was supposed to remain federal property. The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place with sickening clarity. And I understood that Catherine's death wasn't just about family jealousy or custody disputes. It was about covering up crimes that reached all the way to Washington, D.C. Catherine found evidence that some of the claims filed in her name were connected to a network of corrupt officials and territorial administrators who were stealing mineral rights and selling them to private mining companies. Pa continued, his fingers finally touching the satchel's worn leather. She was going to take that evidence to the federal marshals, expose the whole operation, and probably get us all killed in the process. The irony was bitter as medicine. Catherine had died trying to expose the corruption that had made our false identity possible, and now the same evidence she'd died protecting was sitting on the table in front of us like a delayed action bomb. But as Pa began to open the satchel, Sarah spun away from the window with alarm written across her angular features. "Someone's coming," she said, her hand already reaching for the rifle. "Multiple riders moving fast despite the storm." The sound of approaching horses cut through the wind like a death sentence, and I realized that our mountain refuge had been discovered by people who would kill to keep the secrets in that satchel buried forever. The riders appeared through the blizzard like vengeful spirits, their dark forms barely visible against the white fury of the storm, but moving with the determined purpose of men who knew exactly where they were going. Sarah had already extinguished most of the lamps, plunging the cabin into near darkness except for the dying glow of the fireplace, and I could hear her checking her rifle with the efficient movements of someone preparing for a fight she might not survive. Pa stuffed the unopened satchel inside his coat and moved to a position where he could see out the front window without exposing himself to potential gunfire. "How many?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. "4, maybe." "5," Pa replied, his own rifle now in his hands and ready for use. "Well-armed, well-mounted, not the kind of men who get lost in storms like this." The implication was clear. These weren't travelers seeking shelter. They were hunters who'd followed our trail through the mountain pass, despite conditions that should have made pursuit impossible. Through the window, I could see the dark shapes of men dismounting from horses that steamed in the frigid air, their movements coordinated and professional in a way that spoke of military or law enforcement training. But something about their approach felt wrong, too aggressive and secretive. For legitimate federal marshals, too organized and well-equipped for ordinary criminals. "They're not here to arrest us," Sarah said, voicing the fear that was crawling up my spine like ice water. "They're here to make sure we never tell anyone what we know." The riders spread out around the cabin with tactical precision, cutting off escape routes and establishing fields of fire that would make any attempt to flee suicidal. As I crouched in the darkness, listening to boots crunching through snow and the metallic sounds of weapons being readied, I understood that the storm that had brought us to this hidden valley had also delivered us into the hands of people who would kill without hesitation to protect secrets worth more than our lives. The evidence Catherine had died trying to expose was about to cost us everything, and the only question remaining was whether we would live long enough to make her sacrifice mean something or die as anonymously as she had, frozen and forgotten, in the Alaskan wilderness. The first shot shattered the night silence and the cabin's front window simultaneously, sending glass fragments spinning through the air like deadly snow. Sarah returned fire immediately, her rifle's muzzle flash illuminating her face for a brief moment before she rolled away from the window into deeper shadows. Pa had positioned himself near the back door, his weapon trained on the darkness outside, waiting for the inevitable attempt to breach our defenses from multiple directions. "They want us alive," Sarah called out between rifle reports, her voice grim with the certainty of someone who understood the tactics being used against us. "They're shooting to pin us down, not to kill, at least not yet." The distinction offered little comfort as bullets continued to punch through the cabin walls, sending splinters of wood flying and filling the air with the acrid smell of gunpowder. I huddled behind the heavy wooden table, clutching the locket that had started this nightmare while listening to the systematic destruction of our temporary sanctuary. Outside, I could hear men calling to each other in voices, too distorted by wind and distance to make out individual words, but their tone carried the professional calm of soldiers executing a planned assault. Another window exploded inward, followed immediately by the thud of boots on the cabin's wooden porch, and I realized that our attackers were closing in for the final phase of whatever they had planned for us. Pa's rifle boomed from the back of the cabin, followed by a scream that cut through the storm like a blade, but the sound of breaking glass from the kitchen told us that our defenses had been breached. "They're inside!" Sarah shouted, swinging her rifle toward the new threat. But even as she moved, I could see more dark figures silhouetted against the storm-lit windows. We were surrounded, outgunned, and rapidly running out of time, ammunition, and options. But the satchel pressed against Pa's chest contained secrets that men were willing to kill for, and that meant it also contained our only hope of survival, if we could find a way to use those secrets as leverage before the bullets found their mark. The gunfight erupted into chaos as armed men poured through the cabin's shattered windows and splintered door, their dark forms moving with military precision through the smoke and shadows. Pa's rifle spoke twice more before a bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the wall beside the fireplace, blood spreading across his heavy wool shirt like spilled ink on snow. Sarah had positioned herself behind the kitchen doorway, using the solid log frame as cover while she picked off targets with the methodical accuracy of someone who'd learned to shoot for survival rather than sport. "The back room!" she shouted over the gunfire, gesturing toward a narrow door I'd assumed led to storage space. "There's a tunnel! Get your father and go!" But even as she spoke, I could see we were being overwhelmed by superior numbers and firepower, our attackers advancing through the cabin with the confidence of men who'd done this kind of work before. A bullet whined past my head, close enough that I could feel the heat of its passage, and I realized that staying put meant certain death, while running might only delay the inevitable. Pa was struggling to reload his rifle with one good arm, his face gray with pain and blood loss, but his eyes still burned with the stubborn determination that had kept us alive in the wilderness for 15 years. "Take the papers," he gasped, pressing the leather satchel against my chest with trembling hands. "Find someone who'll listen, someone who can make this right." The weight of Catherine's evidence felt heavier than lead in my hands, and I understood that Pa was asking me to carry on a mission that had already cost 2 lives and might cost several more before the truth finally came to light. But as another window exploded inward and more armed figures swarmed into our refuge, I realized that Pa's sacrifice would be meaningless unless I could find a way to get both of us out of this death trap alive. The hidden door Sarah had indicated opened onto a narrow passage carved directly into the mountain stone, its walls rough-hewn and barely wide enough for a single person to navigate without scraping their shoulders on the rock. Emergency supplies had been cached along the walls, lanterns, ammunition, preserved food, blankets, evidence that this escape route had been planned and prepared years in advance. I helped Pa into the tunnel despite his protests that he was slowing us down, his wounded arm hanging useless at his side, while blood continued to seep through the makeshift bandage I'd torn from my undershirt. "Sarah," I called back toward the cabin, but her rifle had fallen silent, and through the tunnel entrance, I could see muzzle flashes that suggested the fight was moving deeper into the building. "Go," Pa whispered, his voice weak, but urgent. "She's buying us time. Don't waste it." The tunnel sloped downward into darkness, following what seemed to be a natural fissure in the mountain that had been widened and improved over many years. Our footsteps echoed strangely in the confined space, mixing with the distant sounds of gunfire and shouting that filtered down from the cabin above. The temperature dropped as we descended, and I could feel cold air moving through the passage, suggesting it opened somewhere else on the mountainside. "Where does this lead?" I asked. But Pa was saving his strength for walking, his breathing labored and his steps increasingly unsteady. The stolen satchel bumped against my ribs with each step, a constant reminder of the secrets that had brought death to our door and might yet cost us everything. Behind us, the sounds of conflict were fading, replaced by an ominous silence that suggested the battle for the cabin was over, and given Sarah's prolonged silence, I feared the outcome had not been in our favor. The tunnel emerged from a concealed opening behind a massive boulder field on the mountain's north face, the exit, so well camouflaged that I would have walked past it a dozen times without noticing the entrance. The storm was beginning to weaken, though snow still fell steadily, and the wind continued to howl through the peaks above us, with enough force to steal the breath from our lungs. Pa collapsed against a sheltered rock formation, his face pale. As winter moon and his breathing shallow, the blood loss from his shoulder wound taking its toll despite our desperate pace through the escape route. "Can't go much further," he admitted, his voice barely audible over the wind. "You'll have to finish this alone." I knelt beside him in the snow, pressing my scarf against his wound to slow the bleeding while scanning the mountainside for signs of pursuit. "I'm not leaving you," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I could see smoke rising from the direction of the hidden cabin, black against the gray sky in a way that suggested the structure was burning. Whether Sarah had escaped or died fighting, whether our attackers were already following our trail or searching for it, I couldn't tell from our position. But the cold was becoming more dangerous with each passing minute. Pa's lips were turning blue despite the protection of his heavy coat, and I knew he wouldn't survive another hour of exposure without shelter and medical attention. "There's another cabin," he said, pointing with his good arm toward a ridge barely visible through the falling snow. 2 miles north, marked with 3 blazes on a dead pine. Emergency supplies, radio equipment. Sarah set it up years ago as a final fallback position. The prospect of forcing Pa to travel another 2 miles through deep snow seemed like a death sentence, but staying where we were would accomplish the same result more slowly. As I helped him to his feet, I caught sight of movement in the distance, dark figures emerging from the smoke that marked the burning cabin, their forms spread out in a search pattern that would eventually bring them to our position. The journey to the emergency cabin became a nightmare of endurance that tested every survival skill Pa had ever taught me, each step through the deep snow requiring more effort than the last as his condition continued to deteriorate. I fashioned a crude travois from fallen branches and rope from the tunnel supplies, dragging him through the forest when walking became impossible, following the blazed trail markers that led through terrain so rugged it seemed designed to break the spirit of anyone foolish enough to attempt passage. The storm provided cover from our pursuers, but also created conditions that made travel increasingly dangerous as afternoon faded toward evening and the temperature continued to drop. Pa drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes muttering about Catherine and secrets that should have stayed buried, other times calling out warnings about men who wore badges but served darker masters than the law. "The radio," he said during one of his lucid moments, his words slurred with cold and blood loss. "Contact the federal marshal in Fairbanks, Delaney, Thomas Delaney. He's been investigating the mining corruption for months, waiting for evidence solid enough to move against the whole network." The name meant nothing to me, but I memorized it along with the other fragments of information Pa revealed during our desperate trek through the wilderness. The satchel's weight seemed to increase with each mile, not from its physical mass, but from the growing understanding of what it represented. The difference between justice and cover-up, between truth and the kind of lies that required murder to maintain. Behind us, I occasionally caught glimpses of our pursuers, dark shapes moving through the forest with the persistence of wolves following a blood trail, their progress slowed by the storm, but not stopped. They knew we couldn't go far in Pa's condition, knew the terrain would eventually trap us, and they had the patience of professional killers who understood that time was on their side. The emergency cabin materialized from the storm like salvation. Itself, a small but solid structure built into a natural depression that provided protection from the worst of the wind. Solar panels on the roof suggested modern equipment inside, and the thin stream of smoke rising from a metal chimney indicated that someone had prepared the place for immediate habitation. I dragged Pa through the front door into blessed warmth. My hands so numb I could barely work the simple latch, and found myself in a space that looked more like a communication center than a wilderness refuge. Radio equipment lined one wall, maps and charts covered another, and a medical kit larger than most small-town clinics hung open beside a cot that looked like it had been waiting for wounded visitors. "Sarah?" a voice called from the back room, and my heart stopped as I realized we weren't alone in the cabin. A woman emerged from what appeared to be a supply storage area, but this wasn't Sarah. This was someone older, gray-haired, wearing clothes that suggested official government business rather than frontier living. She took one look at Pa's condition and moved into action with the efficiency of someone with medical training, checking his wound and vital signs while asking rapid-fire questions about what had happened at the hidden cabin. "I'm Dr. Elizabeth Morrison," she said, the surname hitting me like a physical blow as I realized this must be another member of Catherine's family, another piece of the puzzle that had been consuming my life. "I've been waiting here for 3 days, hoping Sarah would make contact, but when I saw the smoke from the valley, I knew something had gone wrong." As she worked to stabilize Pa's condition with supplies from the medical kit, I found myself holding the leather satchel like a shield against the growing complexity of revelations that seemed to multiply with each hour. "You're Catherine's older sister?" I said, the words feeling like questions even though I somehow knew they were true. "And you're here because of what's in this bag." Dr. Morrison's hands never stopped moving as she treated Pa's wound, but her eyes fixed on the satchel, with an intensity that confirmed my suspicions. "I'm here because my sister died trying to expose corruption that reaches from the territorial government all the way to Washington, and because the evidence she gathered is the only thing that can bring her killers to justice." The radio equipment crackled to life under Dr. Morrison's expert hands, its sophisticated electronics a stark contrast to the rustic cabin that housed them, and I realized this entire network of hidden refugees and escape routes had been planned as part of a larger operation to expose the mining corruption. "Federal Marshal Delaney, this is Dr. Morrison at Site 7. She spoke into the microphone with the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention. "I have the package and 2 civilians in need of immediate extraction." Static filled the air for several seconds before a man's voice responded, tinged with relief and urgency. "Dr. Morrison, we've been monitoring radio chatter about a firefight in your sector. Are you secure?" Her answer came without hesitation, though I could see her checking the windows as she spoke. "Negative. Hostile forces are in pursuit and may have our location. Recommend immediate air support if available." The conversation that followed was conducted in a mixture of code words and technical language that I couldn't fully understand, but the general meaning was clear. Federal forces were moving into the area, arrests were being prepared, and the evidence Catherine had died protecting was finally going to see the light of day. But even as hope began to flicker in my chest like a candle flame, the sound of approaching engines cut through the storm outside, and Dr. Morrison's face went pale as she realized our pursuers had found us. "They're here," she said, reaching for a rifle that was obviously familiar in her hands. "Whatever happens, that satchel cannot fall into their hands. Too many lives depend on what's inside." As I looked at Pa, unconscious on the medical cot with blood still seeping through his bandages, and Dr. Morrison preparing for what might be our last stand, I understood that the rescue I'd hoped for was about to become a fight for survival that would determine whether Catherine's sacrifice had any meaning at all. The storm outside was breaking, but the real tempest was just beginning, and somewhere in the static filled radio transmissions and approaching engine noise, I could hear the sound of justice finally catching up with the men who thought they could murder their way to security. The engines belonged to snowmobiles, their mechanical roar cutting through the storm with the aggressive persistence of predators closing in for the kill. Dr. Morrison moved with military precision, checking weapons and ammunition while simultaneously monitoring the radio for updates from Marshal Delaney's approaching forces. "They'll try to take us alive if possible," she said, her voice grim with professional assessment. "The evidence is worthless to them unless they can verify its contents and identify any copies that might exist." Through the cabin windows, I could see the approaching headlights cutting through the swirling snow, at least 6 machines moving in a coordinated pattern that suggested their operators had training in tactical assault. Pa stirred on the medical cot, his eyes focusing with difficulty as the sound of approaching danger penetrated his pain-hazed consciousness. "Elizabeth?" he whispered, recognition flickering across his pale features. "Catherine's sister. I should have known you'd be involved in this." Dr. Morrison's smile was grim but warm as she checked the safety on her rifle. "Catherine wrote to me before she died, told me about the evidence she'd gathered and her fears about what might happen if she tried to expose it alone. I've been working with federal investigators for 8 months trying to build a case strong enough to take down the entire network." The radio crackled with an update from Marshal Delaney. Federal helicopters were 15 minutes out, but that might be 14 minutes longer than we had before our attackers reached the cabin. "They're not just after the documents," Dr. Morrison continued, her attention divided between the approaching threat and Pa's medical condition. "They're after everyone who's seen them, everyone who knows what Catherine discovered, everyone who could testify about the murders and corruption that went all the way to territorial administrators and federal mining inspectors." As the snowmobile engines grew louder, and I could see muzzle flashes beginning to light up the darkness outside, I realized that Dr. Morrison was describing not just our enemies, but our fate if we didn't find a way to survive the next few minutes. The final assault began with a coordinated barrage that shattered every window in the cabin simultaneously, filling the air with glass fragments and the deafening roar of automatic weapons. Dr. Morrison returned fire with controlled bursts, her medical training apparently supplemented by combat experience that showed in every movement as she shifted positions to avoid incoming rounds. I dragged Pa off the medical cot onto the floor behind the heaviest furniture I could find. The stolen satchel pressed between us like armor that might somehow deflect the bullets that were systematically destroying our shelter. "The helicopter!" Dr. Morrison shouted over the gunfire, and through the chaos I could hear the distinctive sound of rotor blades cutting through the storm, growing louder with each second. But our attackers had heard it too, and their assault intensified with the desperation of men who knew their window of opportunity was closing rapidly. The front door exploded inward under the impact of what might have been explosives, and dark figures poured through the opening with weapons ready and faces covered by tactical masks that made them look like death itself. Dr. Morrison's rifle spoke twice more before a bullet caught her in the leg, sending her sprawling behind the overturned table where Pa and I huddled with the evidence that had already cost so many lives. "Federal agents!" a voice boomed from outside, amplified by loudspeakers that cut through the gunfire like the voice of justice itself. "Cease fire immediately and surrender your weapons." But the masked men seemed determined to complete their mission, regardless of federal intervention. And I realized that the next few seconds would determine whether we lived to see Catherine's killers brought to justice or died as anonymously as she had, our bodies lost in the Alaskan wilderness along with the truth we'd died trying to protect. As the helicopter's searchlight blazed through the shattered windows and federal agents began their own assault on our attackers, I clutched the leather satchel to my chest and prayed that our rescue had arrived in time to matter. The federal helicopters descended from the storm like mechanical angels of justice, their searchlights cutting through the darkness and turning the battlefield into a theater where shadows danced with muzzle flashes and the smoke of gunpowder. Marshal Delaney's voice boomed across the mountainside through military-grade speakers, demanding surrender with the authority of someone backed by the full power of the United States government. But the masked gunmen who'd been hunting us showed no intention of giving up, their automatic weapons continuing to spit fire even as federal agents rappelled from the hovering aircraft with tactical precision that spoke of extensive combat experience. I pressed myself against the cabin floor beside Pa's unconscious form. The leather satchel trapped between us while bullets continued to punch through the log walls above our heads. Dr. Morrison had managed to apply a tourniquet to her wounded leg, but blood loss was making her movements sluggish even as she tried to return fire from behind our improvised barricade. "It's almost over," she gasped, her voice barely audible over the chaos outside. "Whatever happens, that evidence has to reach Marshal Delaney. Too many people have died for it to disappear now." Through the shattered windows, I could see federal agents in winter camouflage advancing through the snow with the methodical efficiency of soldiers who'd done this kind of work before, their weapons trained on targets I couldn't see but could hear screaming orders and curses into the wind. The gunfire was becoming more sporadic, suggesting that our attackers were either dead, wounded, or running out of ammunition, and for the first time in hours, I allowed myself to hope that we might actually survive this nightmare. But even as that hope flickered to life in my chest, I knew that surviving the battle was only the beginning. The real fight would come when I had to explain how a teenage trapper's daughter had become the keeper of secrets that reached from the frozen riverbanks of Alaska all the way to the corridors of power in Washington, D.C. The silence that followed the last gunshot was more deafening than the battle itself, broken only by the wind howling through the mountains and the mechanical rhythm of helicopter blades maintaining position overhead. Federal agents moved through the cabin with weapons drawn, their faces hidden behind tactical gear, but their movements speaking of professional competence and controlled aggression. Marshal Delaney himself entered through what remained of the front door, a tall man with graying hair and eyes that had seen too much corruption to be surprised by anything else he might encounter. "Dr. Morrison," he said, kneeling beside her to assess her condition, while simultaneously scanning the room for threats. "We got your transmission and moved as fast as we could. Sorry it took so long to reach you." His attention shifted to Pa's unconscious form, and then to me, huddled on the floor with the satchel clutched against my chest like a life preserver. "You must be James Henley's daughter," he said, his voice gentler when addressing someone who was clearly not a combatant. "Dr. Morrison told us about your family's situation. I'm sorry for everything you've been through." But his expression grew harder when his eyes fixed on the leather bag I was holding. "That wouldn't happen to be the evidence your Aunt Catherine died trying to protect, would it?" The weight of his attention felt heavier than the satchel itself, and I realized that the next few minutes would determine not just my own fate, but the outcome of an investigation that had been building for months. "She wasn't my aunt," I said, the words feeling strange in my mouth as I spoke truths I was still trying to understand myself. "Catherine was my mother, adoptive mother. Sarah was my birth mother. And yes, this contains the documents Catherine died for." Marshal Delaney's eyebrows rose slightly at this revelation, but he maintained the professional demeanor of someone accustomed to untangling complex family situations in the course of criminal investigations. "We'll sort out the relationships later," he said, extending his hand toward the satchel. "Right now, I need to see what's inside that bag before anyone else dies trying to protect it." The contents of Catherine's satchel spilled across the cabin's rough wooden table like evidence at a murder trial, each document adding another layer to a conspiracy that reached further and deeper than I could have imagined. Mining claims filed. Under false names, correspondence between territorial officials and private mining companies, financial records showing payments that could only be bribes, and photographs of documents that should never have existed outside of government offices. Catherine had assembled a prosecutor's dream case against corruption that infected every level of Alaska's territorial administration. "This is it," Marshal Delaney breathed, his professional composure cracking as he recognized the significance of what lay before him. "This is what we've been trying to prove for 8 months. The entire network, from the territorial mining inspector all the way up to federal administrators in Washington." Dr. Morrison, despite her wound, had managed to pull herself into a position where she could see the documents, her medical training apparently extended to include enough legal knowledge to understand their implications. "Catherine spent 2 years gathering this evidence," she said, her voice weak but determined. "She knew it would get her killed, but she couldn't live with the knowledge that native tribes were being cheated out of their ancestral lands while corrupt officials got rich selling mining rights that were never legally theirs to sell." Pa stirred on his makeshift bed, consciousness returning slowly as the pain medication Dr. Morrison had administered began to wear off. "The woman by the riverbank," he whispered, his words slurred but understandable. "She came back for more evidence, didn't she? Came back to get proof that would have finished the investigation, and someone killed her for it." Marshal Delaney's face was grim as he continued examining the documents, some of which were marked with dates from just weeks before Catherine's death. According to these records, she'd identified at least 12 territorial officials who were taking bribes, plus 3 federal mining inspectors and 2 administrators in the Bureau of Indian Affairs who were approving illegal land transfers. The scope of the corruption was staggering, but even more shocking was the realization that Catherine's murder had been just one of many committed to protect this criminal enterprise. The marshal's radio crackled with reports from his agents, painting a picture of the night's violence that was both satisfying and sobering in its scope. 5 of our attackers were dead, 2 more wounded and in custody, with weapons and equipment that suggested military or law enforcement backgrounds, rather than common criminals. "These weren't just hired guns," one agent reported through the static. "We've got federal identification cards, communications equipment that requires government clearance, and weapons that are supposed to be restricted to law enforcement agencies." Marshal Delaney's expression grew darker with each report, and I could see him making connections that painted an even more sinister picture of the conspiracy Catherine had died exposing. "Corrupt federal agents," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "They weren't just covering up mining fraud, they were using federal resources to commit murder and intimidation on behalf of private interests." Dr. Morrison struggled to sit up straighter, her medical bag open beside her as she tended to her own wound with the efficiency of someone accustomed to battlefield conditions. Catherine's final letter mentioned that she suspected some of the federal agents investigating the mining corruption were actually working for the people they were supposed to be investigating, she said. She was planning to take her evidence directly to Washington, bypass the territorial administration entirely when they killed her. The irony was bitter as winter wind. Catherine had been murdered by the very people who should have been protecting her, federal agents who'd sworn oaths to uphold justice but had sold themselves to mining interests that valued profit over human life. As I listened to the radio reports and watched Marshal Delaney examine evidence that represented months of dangerous investigation, I began to understand that Catherine's death hadn't been in vain. It had exposed a level of corruption that would send shockwaves through the territorial government and possibly reach all the way to Washington. But the price paid for that justice included not just Catherine's life, but potentially the lives of everyone who'd tried to help her, and I wasn't sure any victory was worth such a terrible cost. The full scope of the conspiracy began to emerge as Marshal Delaney organized the evidence into categories that revealed the systematic nature of the corruption Catherine had uncovered. Mining companies had been purchasing territorial and federal officials like commodities, buying influence that allowed them to claim mineral rights on native lands, national forest property, and even established homesteads where families had been living for generations. Your mother, Catherine, wasn't just investigating mining fraud, the marshal explained, his voice heavy with the weight of revelations that kept getting worse. She'd discovered that some of these illegal mining operations were connected to a network that included territorial judges, federal land office administrators, and even senators in Washington who were receiving financial benefits in exchange for blocking legislation that would have protected native rights. The photographs in the satchel showed meetings between officials who should never have been in the same room together, handwritten agreements that constituted clear evidence of conspiracy, and financial records that traced bribe money from mining, company accounts to the personal finances of people sworn to serve the public interest. Dr. Morrison had managed to stabilize her own condition enough to assist in organizing the evidence, her medical training apparently including enough investigative experience to recognize the significance of various documents. "The woman you found by the riverbank," she said, addressing me directly for the first time since the shooting ended, was carrying additional evidence that would have completed the case Catherine was building. Evidence that someone was willing to kill for rather than allow it to reach federal investigators. Pa's breathing had stabilized, and though he remained weak from blood loss, his mind was clear enough to follow the conversation and add details that filled gaps in the story I'd been trying to understand. "Sarah, your birth mother, had been helping Catherine gather evidence for months," he said, his voice stronger than it had been since the shooting. "She knew the territory better than anyone, knew which claims were legitimate and which were fraudulent, knew which officials could be trusted and which ones were taking money from mining interests." The revelation that my birth mother had been part of Catherine's investigation added another layer of complexity to a family history that seemed to grow more tangled with each new piece of information. But it also explained why Sarah had been living in hiding, why she'd established escape routes and emergency shelters, and why she'd been prepared for the violence that eventually found us in that hidden valley. The final pieces of the puzzle fell into place as Marshal Delaney's investigation team processed the crime scene and began connecting evidence from the night's violence to the broader corruption case they'd been building. The dead gunmen carried identification that linked them to a private security company with contracts throughout the territorial government, a company that officially provided protection services but apparently specialized in intimidation and murder when their clients required more permanent solutions to their problems. "We've been tracking this security company for months," one of the federal agents reported, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone whose suspicions had finally been confirmed. "They've been involved in at least 6 other deaths throughout the territory, all people who were asking questions about mining rights or territorial land claims." The scope of the criminal enterprise was staggering. Corrupt officials selling illegal mining rights, private security companies murdering witnesses and investigators, and a network of bribery and intimidation that had infected territorial government. From the local level all the way to Washington, Catherine's evidence would be enough to bring down dozens of officials and expose a conspiracy that had been operating for years, stealing land from native tribes and honest settlers while enriching a small group of corrupt administrators and their mining company partners. "Your mother died a hero," Marshal Delaney told me, his words carrying the weight of official recognition, but little comfort for the grief that still gnawed at my chest. Without her investigation, this corruption would have continued indefinitely. destroying communities and stealing resources that belonged to the people of Alaska. As federal agents continued to process evidence and coordinate with investigators in other parts of the territory, I began to understand that Catherine's death would eventually lead to justice for crimes that had seemed too big and too powerful to ever be stopped. But sitting in that destroyed cabin, surrounded by the aftermath of violence that had consumed my family for over a decade, I wondered if any amount of justice could truly compensate for the lives that had been lost in the pursuit of truth. The dawn that broke over the mountains revealed a landscape transformed by more than just the passing storm, its clean white surfaces hiding the violence and corruption that had stained this remote corner of Alaska for far too long. Federal helicopters continued to arrive throughout the morning, bringing investigators, medical personnel, and equipment needed to process what had become the largest territorial corruption case in Alaska's history. I stood outside the destroyed cabin, wrapped in a federal agent's spare coat, and watching teams of investigators document evidence that would reshape the territorial government and send dozens of officials to federal prison. Pa had been airlifted to a hospital in Fairbanks, his condition stable but requiring surgery to repair the damage from his gunshot wound. Dr. Morrison had insisted on remaining at the scene despite her own injuries, her medical expertise needed, to assist with the investigation and her testimony crucial to understanding the full scope of Catherine's work. "What happens now?" I asked Marshal Delaney as he supervised the loading of evidence that would travel to federal courts in Seattle and Washington, where the highest levels of the conspiracy would finally face justice. His answer came with the weary satisfaction of someone who'd spent months pursuing criminals who seemed untouchable. "Now we prosecute everyone involved, from the territorial mining inspector who took the first bribe to the senators in Washington who blocked protective legislation in exchange for campaign contributions," he said. "Your mother's evidence gives us everything we need to clean house from top to bottom." But his expression grew gentler as he focused on my situation rather than the broader investigation. "As for you, young lady, you'll need to decide what kind of life you want to build from the ashes of this nightmare." The question hung in the air like smoke from the burned cabin, and I realized that for the first time in my life I was free to choose my own destiny rather than live with the consequences of other people's secrets and lies. Catherine had died to expose the truth. Sarah had lived in exile to protect it, and Pa had carried the weight of family deceptions that had nearly destroyed us all. But the choices I made from this point forward would be mine alone. The epilogue to our story unfolded over the following months as federal investigators dismantled the corruption network that Catherine had died exposing, her evidence leading to arrests and convictions that reached from territorial courthouses to the halls of Congress in Washington. 17 territorial officials were indicted on charges ranging from bribery to conspiracy to commit murder, while 3 federal administrators and 2 senators faced corruption charges that would end their careers and send them to federal prison. The mining companies that had purchased illegal claims lost millions in investments and faced criminal charges for their role in the conspiracy, while native tribes and honest settlers began the long process of reclaiming land that had been stolen through fraudulent transactions. Pa recovered from his wounds, but decided to leave Alaska permanently, unable to bear the memories that haunted every familiar landmark and unwilling to rebuild a life on ground stained with so much violence and deception. Sarah, my birth mother, emerged from hiding to testify at the federal trials, her knowledge of the territory and its corrupt officials proving crucial to prosecutors building cases against the entire network. Dr. Morrison returned to her medical practice but continued working with federal investigators, her expertise in territorial affairs making her invaluable to ongoing efforts to identify and prosecute remaining corruption throughout Alaska's government. As for me, I chose to stay in the territory, but leave behind the life of isolation that had defined my childhood, moving to Fairbanks to attend school and eventually study law, with the goal of ensuring that the kind of corruption Catherine died fighting would never again find fertile ground in Alaska's government. The leather satchel that had contained her evidence sits in a federal evidence vault now, its contents having accomplished what she'd hoped when she began gathering proof of the conspiracy that ultimately cost her life. But the real monument to her memory isn't in any courthouse or government building. It's in the knowledge that sometimes the most important battles are fought by ordinary people who refuse to accept that corruption and violence are simply the price of doing business in a frontier territory, and that the truth, once properly documented and courageously shared, has the power to bring down even the most powerful criminals when justice finally catches up with their crimes.